Hello, my name is Brian Bledsoe, and I'm a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at Colorado State University. And I'm delighted to be speaking with you today about stream and wetland restoration. I have about 25 years experience in the field of stream and wetland restoration, and it's a subject near and dear to my heart. So I'll try to summarize some of my experiences and observations over the last 25 years here in a matter of a few slides. So here's an outline of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to say a few words about just the very basics of stream and wetland processes and their hydrology and geomorphology and sort of the driving forces behind how streams and wetlands operate in the landscape. I'm going to give a brief definition of what I think ecological restoration is and what do we mean when we talk about restoring streams and wetlands. I'll say a few words about our various motivations for restoring streams and wetlands. Then we'll look at a quick summary, a generalized restoration process, and I'll give you a snapshot of some common approaches. By no means will it be exhaustive, but we'll look at some common approaches to stream and wetland restoration and then some concluding thoughts. So one of the most fundamental ideas in stream and wetland restoration and sort of the basis of having a higher likelihood of successfully restoring streams and wetlands is to think of them not just as things in space, but as processes in time. This graphic shows the three-dimensional nature of a river floodplain with respect to space, but it's also got the clock in the background. So a major theme throughout this conversation we're having today will be the need to think across scales of both space and time in addressing damaged or degraded wetlands and streams. Here's a shot of a meandering river here in Colorado with a very well-connected, broad floodplain with a complex mosaic of different plant community assemblages. Let's take a moment to consider this stream and all of the variables and degrees of freedom that are involved in thinking about stream and floodplain wetland restoration. If we imagine that there's some watershed disturbance that changes the flows of water and sediment delivered to this stream and floodplain, and we try to list out all of the ways that this stream and the riparian communities can adjust to those changes, we can quickly rattle off 10 or 12 variables just with respect to the stream channel. This stream could adjust its width, depth, slope, velocity, and we could break those down into things like riffle widths and depths, or pool depths, maximum depths. There's also the planform, the sinuosity, the wavelength of the meanders along the floodplain, the radius of curvature relative to the width. There's the bed forms that we see in the channel, the pool riffle sequences, and their amplitude and frequency. So we really don't have that many physical relations to close up this system of unknowns. So we necessarily employ a lot of different tools, including a historical perspective and using analogs of other systems as sort of a template or a benchmark for trying to come up with designs and ideas for restoration. We can also look here to the floodplain and see that there's heterogeneous mosaic of soil moisture conditions, and so this interaction between overbank flows and the soils and materials on availability of plant propagules and so forth give us a very rich and broad palette to work with here. Another important consideration I've already alluded to is the hierarchical perspective that the smaller scales in rivers and wetlands at a a local site are a manifestation of larger scale processes that are constraining what we see at the local scale. Essentially, a river is a manifestation of its entire watershed, and so when we think about restoration, it's most often useful to think at the watershed scale, the valley segment scale, the reach scale, and down within a reach in terms of small scale habitat processes. Another key concept is the hydrologic regime, or simply the flow regime. Whether we're talking about wetlands or streams, the pattern of flows in terms of their magnitudes, frequencies, durations, timing, rate of change, those are essentially the maestro, if you will, of the aquatic ecosystem orchestra. Here we see some of the ecological linkages with low flows in terms of fish habitat and base flows for riparian vegetation and benthic macroinvertebrates, and of course those aquatic insects feed birds and other fauna in the riparian zone. And then high flows also are extremely important in terms of fish spawning and floodplain plant communities and regenerating riparian communities, and also for animals like birds that utilize the floodplain at their critical life stages. So this slide depicts how I think about rivers in terms of driving variables, boundary conditions, and the forms and structures that are produced by that interaction. So at the top you see a time series of flows delivered to the river from its watershed, and a time series of flows of sediment, both coarse and fine. Those interact with boundary conditions like the slope of the valley that the river sits in, and the materials that it's inherited from the valley, and these external influences like vegetation. And those interact with one another, those driving processes and those imposed boundary conditions give rise to the wide diversity of channel forms that we see in the world, with their associated functions and ecological linkages. Wetlands, on the other hand, are areas that aren't necessarily flowing lotic ecosystems like we were just talking about. Wetlands are areas that are simply periodically or permanently inundated by surface or groundwater, and they support hydrophytic vegetation, that is, vegetation that's adapted for life in wet soils. And there are a whole host of wetland types, and that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. So the important point is that wetlands have three key distinguishing characteristics. They have surface flooding or saturation for some period of time during the growing season that gives rise to vegetation that's adapted to those saturated soil conditions. And of course those hydric soils have characteristics that are indicative of low or fluctuating oxygen, like reduced iron or manganese or accumulation of organic matter. So a key theme in both river and wetland restoration is understanding the hydrology. I won't talk much about classification, but there is a very important classification of wetlands known as the hydrogeomorphic classification that basically helps us understand how a wetland functions based on what sources of water it receives and the relative dominance of those water sources in its overall hydrologic budget. So some wetlands are dominated by water delivered via precipitation, whereas others are driven primarily by groundwater. Others are substantially influenced by overbank flows, and so understanding the landscape position, the geomorphic context, and the sources, key sources of water is a fundamental requirement for having a physically based restoration plan that's likely to perform as intended. A little quick segue here into coastal wetlands. They, like the systems that we've been talking about, are also driven by hydrology, but there's also another very important factor here, and that's the salinity of the system, which is another key influence on the plant community assemblages we see and the overall ecological structure and function of these systems. So, what is ecological restoration? Here is a definition from the Society for Ecological Restoration. It's very simple and elegant. It's the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So it's not the idea that we are taking the system back to some pre-existing state. This definition basically implies that we're re-establishing processes and we are facilitators of recovery. The Society of Wetland Scientists define it this way: re-establishing ecological processes, functions, abiotic linkages that lead to an ecosystem that is sustainable, can bounce back disturbance, and is integrated within its landscape. So something I really like about this definition is the emphasis on the landscape context. So I put together a slide here that expresses a spectrum of characteristics that may or may not be present in a particular restoration endeavor. The more a project has these attributes, the more I would say it is clearly restoration, and it's more likely to be sustainable. And the less it has of these attributes, we might question whether it's truly a sustainable approach to restoration. So restoration is not about building habitat or constructing wetlands or streams. It's about reestablishing the processes, the dynamic processes that allow those systems to structure themselves, to build habitat, sometimes destroy habitat, and rebuild habitat. So the question is not, can we go out and build habitat? It's, can we give the river or the wetland the capacity to do those things for itself by reestablishing hydrologic and geomorphic processes and dynamic fluxes of water and sediment and organic matter and heat and propagules and all of the materials that are fluxing through an ecosystem. There's an emphasis on long-term resilience and the capacity for bouncing back from disturbances. There's an emphasis on multiple scales of space and time, and thinking at watershed scales across long periods of time will often produce a better outcome with respect to a restoration project. Connectivity in those three dimensions we looked at in the first slide, and the hyporeic zone being an important consideration that you may not be familiar with, but that's the area of shallow groundwater that wraps around the channel bed and the stream banks, and is very important for nutrients and for nutrient life down in the riverbed, in the benthos. So those lateral, vertical, longitudinal connections get reestablished. There's a focus not on any single species, but on many species and native biota and diversity and food web connections. Ultimately, restoration is an experiment, and as such, it should be a process that's something we can learn from. It's driven by hypotheses, and there's monitoring that provides feedback in terms of learning more about how to do this and whether things are working or not. And ultimately, restoration is not just about ecosystems with humans outside those ecosystems. It can also, and I believe an important part of this, is reestablishing human connections with ecosystems. So why restore streams and wetlands? Well, streams and wetlands are obviously central to life. Many essential life-giving ecosystem services and natural capital, and stewardship of these systems is very important for future generations, and aquatic systems are threatened at a global scale. And the 5 principal categories of those threats, I believe, are overexploitation, and that takes many forms, pollution, fragmentation, destruction of habitat, and invasions by non-native species. So there are many reasons to restore streams and wetlands, but another key reason, the law of the land here in the United States drives a lot of restoration activities, where the first statement in the Clean Water Act is that its purpose and intention is to restore and maintain chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Wetland conversion dramatically altered the landscape across the United States. You see a comparison here between the 1780s and the 1980s, and the reduction in wetlands across the conterminous U.S. The extent of grazed land and cropland has grown exponentially. There's now an area of the United States about the size of Ohio that's paved, and urbanization is accelerating around the world, and there are something in the neighborhood of 80,000 dams over 2 meters high here in the lower 48 states. With respect to wetlands graphic, one dot represents 8,000 hectares of land that's been drained since European colonization. So again, we have dramatically changed the landscape, and some of these alterations are very direct, where we physically manipulate stream channels. Sometimes we straighten them out, like the Kissimmee River you see here. The old planform, the highly sinuous planform, is being restored in the left of the slide, where you see the straight channel that was dug in the 1960s. And so there was this period of channelization and dam building that went on, where sinuous like this were straightened out. They were given more power and energy, which often resulted in disconnections from floodplains and erosion, given that the slope is steepened and there's more erosive power. And when you put those two things together, what you typically come up with is a need to invest this. So there's a lot of work to be done out there. Is stream and wetland restoration working? I would say to some extent yes, although not at the level that is commensurate with our expenditures or investments in it. We spend over $1 billion a year on just stream restoration. And a lot of the past has been dominated by what I would call sort of tactical restoration. That's not really rooted in a watershed scale perspective. It's more about local scale band-aids. And many of those activities, because of the lack of thinking about different scales and focusing on physical processes, the scientific basis of ecological restoration is improving. So many stream restoration projects have been these localized piecemeal things that are not sustainable, but there are many examples of successful restoration activities that involve thinking about the dynamic processes in river systems, like floods that are required for cottonwood regeneration, and what we understand now about flow regimes and how cottonwood germinate on the floodplain and those requirements. If we bring that scientific knowledge to bear, we can do some really effective work. So the restoration process basically involves understanding your watershed. Where has your watershed been historically? Where is it going? And how do humans and natural disturbances relate to that? It involves building commitments with institutions and constituents and stakeholders. and keeping those commitments for the long term. So restoration is just as much a social and economic enterprise as it is a technical one. Most of the projects that have failed in part because they lacked clear goals and objectives. So developing clear objectives and hypotheses to drive the restoration project is critical. We should always look for passive solutions where we perhaps remove a stressor and we don't rely on heavy-handed interventions. Sometimes a simple action like, for example, removing excessive grazing from a stream can do wonders for the ecological integrity of that stream. We should simultaneously design our watershed restoration plan and our monitoring plan so that that monitoring plan is focused on the key uncertainties and can help us learn in the most effective way whether our project is working and how we might improve our understanding of how to conduct restoration in the future. So we obviously have to implement the project, but there's got to be a clear feedback at the end where we evaluate our success and try to learn from what we're doing. A few approaches to stream and wetland restoration. We copy or emulate reference ecosystems. This is a very common practice in wetland restoration where we look to reference systems as a template or a blueprint for trying to understand how to reestablish the key processes in a degraded system. Again, hydrology is at the root of all of this, so water budgets are a critical component of wetland restoration and understanding flow regimes and streams. So getting the hydrology right is perhaps the most fundamental aspect of restoring streams and wetlands. Scientific understanding around environmental flows has really grown in recent years, in no small part thanks to Dr. Poff, who you're also hearing from. And this slide basically shows the idea that if we understand the system and its key processes and physical ecological linkages, we can some critical aspects of that flow regime and critical ecological processes with less water. So this is a perspective where we try to understand the most critical components of the flow patterns in the system, keep those intact while at the same time balancing the needs of the ecosystem with human demands on the water. Here's just an example of where reestablishing high flows along the Big Lost River in Idaho resulted in reestablishment of cottonwood recruitment. We also use analogs in geomorphology. Meandering channels have these very intriguing and beautiful sinuous serpentine where there are predictable scaling properties. For example, in a pool riffle channel, if we measure distances between riffles, we see that there's a tendency for them to space themselves about 6 bankful channel widths apart, or approximately 2 pi actually along the channel. So we can exploit these kinds of scaling relationships to help us think about how to reestablish a sustainable form in the river. Another example here is the tendency for single thread rivers to scale with about the square root of discharge as far as their bankful width. There are many other approaches: dam removal, reestablishing fish passage, working with beaver, and so forth. But this hopefully gives you a little flavor of the multifaceted nature of stream and wetland restoration. We also rely on bioindicators. As opposed to measuring a whole host of chemical factors, for example, various nutrients and metals and dissolved oxygen and temperature and total suspended solids and so forth, we can look to the biota that live in these systems to help us integrate all of those factors. So by identifying taxa that are sensitive to forms of environmental degradation, we can learn a lot about whether our restoration activities are working, whether it's those aquatic insects or the fishes that you see in this slide, or periphyton in a stream. These all tell us a story about how our restoration actions are performing. Ecological engineering is an emerging area within the engineering community, and it's really an integration, as you might gather from the name, of ecology and engineering, which now has a journal, several textbooks. And I want to touch on the idea of self-organization, and that again is the idea that we are facilitators of restoration. Ecological engineering emphasizes the idea that ecosystems have the capacity for self-organization, and if we can exploit that by providing the right ingredients and letting the ecosystem do a lot of the work and decision making, if you will, to be anthropomorphic here, we can essentially rely on that to produce better outcomes. And this also adds an element of societal interaction, where we're not just reestablishing ecosystems that have been present in the past, but with new patterns of flow and sediment and these watershed fluxes, we may be interested in establishing new kinds of ecosystem. And of course, that may also be driven by the ecosystem services and amenities and benefits that are provided by those ecosystems. So in this slide, it basically highlights a process driven by solar power, in which we have hydrologic and atmospheric interacting with soils, and we provide the right ingredients in terms of the hydrology, the soils, propagules. You see an animal dispersing seeds in this slide, and essentially letting the ecosystem to some extent design itself. So in conclusion, sustainable stream and wetland restoration involves several critical factors, in my opinion, based on my experience and the experience of others. We first have to think about these systems as not just things in space, but as processes in times, and we have to think across time scales as well as spatial scales. And we have to understand how a particular system sits in the landscape, what are the driving variables, and how have those been altered over time by either natural processes or human influences. So the emphasis is on restoring process rather than just building static habitats. When we define success in restoration, it can't just be defined as, well, we built the project. Success has to be based on effectiveness measured in terms of these bioindicators and the reestablishment of processes and the long-term capacity of the system to be resilient in the face of perturbations and disturbances. And of course, all of this requires a truly interdisciplinary, perhaps transdisciplinary approach where we focus on the entire ecosystem rather than a single species. And so this necessitates working with teams and learning how to communicate across disciplines. So in summary, there's a lot of work to be done out there, and this is a great field to be in because you learn so much about so many different things. It's very challenging, but it's also very rewarding. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today about stream and wetland restoration.